Yeah, so the idea to kind of put a ribbon on what Alan was saying. So Angular has built-in services, but we can also create our own services, which is what we're going to focus on today. And there's a couple of reasons that we may want to use generate our own Angular services. There's a couple of good reasons I would want to do that, which is what we're going to walk through. Does anyone else have any thoughts from the readings? Anything to add upon that? So Audrey says, if I understood it correctly, it's like ordering something that you would need frequently in different contexts for Angular. Yeah, so yeah, that's awesome. So maybe it's something, let me use the example. So remember in Unit 2, how we created that auth helper, that JavaScript auth helper file. So that held all of our authentication information. So a couple of notes about that. So one, we could put all of that authentication code, instead of like dirtying up our controllers and in our server files, why don't we put all of that authentication stuff into a separate file, and we can modularize it, and we can do a module.exports, and then we can require that file in any other controller that we need to use that, one of the authorization methods on. So we did that quite frequently, right? I think we injected it into like the user's controller, and then maybe whatever other controllers we had. But it was a really nice way to be able to share code amongst controllers. So particularly when we create our own services, let's say that we have some code, a piece of authentication code would be a perfect example. So the way that we would share code throughout our application using Angular is maybe we could create a service out of it. And then instead of duplicating that code in different controllers, we can put it in one file and call that a service. And then we can inject that service into the other controllers that may want to take advantage of that code. So kind of first and foremost, if you want to think on a high level, I like to think of Angular services as that module.exports pattern that we used in Unit 2. It's very similar to that. So on a high level, it's a really great way to dry up your code, because you can put all that code in one place. That's kind of like the big obvious reason. Any other thoughts before we move forward? So what I want to do is we're going to go into CodePen and look at a very simple example of the syntax. And then up until lab time, what I want to do is we're going to take Colin's Jiffy app from Friday, and we're actually going to see how we can add a service to that app to dry it up. So that's my goal up until lab time. And then for lab time, I want you guys to keep working on that Jiffy app and try to dry up specifically all of those $HTTP API calls that we created, because using services for $HTTP, any kind of like external API calls, is a very frequently that's a very good reason to use services. And so that's what we'll take a look at today. And just kind of to be redundant or repeating myself, don't think that you have to memorize this stuff. Again, this isn't something that's required for your Unit 3, but it is a really popular pattern in Angular, so it's really good to be familiar with it. So let's talk a little bit about services, then we'll get to our CodePen. So each web application you build with Angular is composed of objects that collaborate to get stuff done. These objects need to be instantiated and wired together using dependency injection for the app to work. And then here in this little piece of code, which we've seen, generally you would do inject a $HTTP or any other type of Angular module. You would inject it into the app like so. You'd put it between the square brackets. And then we saw last week that pattern, the $inject. So we saw this as well. And so usually you would use both of these techniques. So you would pass in the module as an argument into the module itself or the controller itself, and then you'd use that $inject. Does anyone remember the really great reason to use $inject, particularly once you push your stuff to production? I think Colin touched on it as well Friday. Mm-hmm.
Minification.
Yeah, minification is a huge one. So remember, sometimes with the minification process, our wires can get crossed. And so that $inject is a really great preventative method that Angular gives us. So it's a really good practice to use both of them, especially when you're pushing to production. Angular offers several useful built-in services. So I just mentioned these in the parentheses. But for most applications, you'll want to create your own, which is what we're going to see today. And then there's a link here. I'll paste it into Slack. Just if you're curious about all the other built-in services that Angular gives us. So really the only one we've played around with has been $HTTP, but there's a lot of really good ones. That $Q is a really good one as well. We haven't talked about that, but that's kind of the Angular-esque way to create promises. So if you want to take a look at that, maybe that would be useful. But $HTTP is really the most important, frequently used one, particularly for your projects and such. Cool. So services are a great way to dry up our code and make reusable modules that we can use to share information across our application. The service is similar to that authhelper.js file that we created in Unit 2. So you can kind of think about it the same way. If we're going to need to reuse our code at all, it's a good practice to maybe dump that into a service when we're in the Angular world. A little bit of tech geek speak here. So services are singletons. I think we've talked about singletons before. What does that mean? Well, Angular services, or anything that can be injected as a dependency into an Angular controller or some other Angular module, kind of the two big keys about singletons are that, or services rather, is that they're lazily instantiated. So Angular only instantiates a service when it's needed. So one of the great reasons to use a service is because with controllers, every time that we refresh the page or go to a new, actually not even refresh the page, but every time we go to a new state, like Colin talked about on Friday, every time we go to a new state or a new partial view, whatever controller maintains that state gets reinstantiated each time. So that controller actually gets refreshed or reloaded. Which can be a good thing or a bad thing. If we want to persist something to go across different states, we probably want to put that in some sort of service, because a service only gets instantiated when it's needed, and it also stays alive for the lifetime of your app or until you hit refresh or something. And what I mean by that is a service may be a really good use case for using authentication to get a current user, because a current user, if we store that current user in a service, that service would stay alive, for the duration of our application, and we could inject that service into whatever controllers we needed, and we would always have access to that current user variable. So that may be something, a really good use case for a service. And what do we mean by a singleton? So singleton is not specific to Angular by any means, but it just means that each component dependent on a service gets a reference to the single instance generated by the service factory. It's a little wonky. It just means that a service is basically a constructor function under the hood. And every time that we use a service, we don't see it happening, but under the hood, Angular is actually using the new keyword new method. So remember that new is something we use to create constructors, we use with a constructor function to create new instances of something. So it's kind of that same spirit with the singleton as it was with the constructor function. So services and constructor functions are kind of the same thing in this sense. A lot of wonky stuff here, guys. I apologize. So once instantiated, unlike a controller, a service is persisted through the lifetime of your application. So just keep in mind, if you want to store some data, if you want some data to be shared between states, you're going to have to come up with a different strategy besides just storing it in a controller, because the controller is going to get, reinstantiated. But you could put that information into a service and it would, be persisted. So just something to keep in mind. And here's another example. So if your app needs data from an API or a database, we probably don't want to keep loading that same data every time we change routes or states, right? That can get pretty inefficient and expensive. So fetching that data once and holding it in a service makes a lot of sense. And let's take an example of a service, and then we will get to our CodePen code along. So here's an example of what a service pattern looks like. So in this example, so we declare an Angular module, we'll call it my app for funsies. And then we can use that .service method on our Angular module. Very similar to like a .controller or a .config. we can call .service and then pass in the name of that service. And actually there's a typo here because we need to pass, just like a controller, we need to pass in the name of the service and then pass in the function, the declared function for that service. And we'll be doing that in just a moment. And then we can declare a function my service. And then remember that a service has scope, it has a local this method. And so it's maybe a good practice to do a var self equals this. That's a pretty common pattern. And then you can attach methods and properties to this service, just like you would a regular controller or any other object. And here's a couple of bullet points, a couple of other examples for why you may want to use a service. So for authentication is a really common one. So maybe you want to create some sort of service or a function that will check if a web token is valid. We haven't talked about web tokens. Has anyone heard of JWT or JavaScript web tokens before? Okay, so there's several different ways to use authentication and use sessions in an app. And one really popular way is using JavaScript web tokens. We'll talk about that in Unit 4, just so you have some familiarity with it. But the point being, anything authentication related is a good candidate for maybe creating a service around it. Cross-origin resource sharing, or CORS, C-O-R-S. You guys may have run into errors with this last week, but does anyone know what CORS, what the gist of a CORS error or what cross-origin resource sharing refers to? Man, CORS is the bane of my existence sometimes. Does anyone have a, I think this came up on Friday, if I remember correctly, maybe not, but does anyone have an explanation for what CORS is? This comes up a lot with APIs. All right, I'll send you guys an article for a deep dive on this if you want. It's super kind of crazy, wonky. But the idea is that particular API endpoints, if you have like a database serving some data with some API endpoints, cross-origin resource sharing means that you need to declare what domains that your API can accept requests from. It's kind of a security thing. Because if you create an API and you make it public, you want to have some control over who can access your API. When we access APIs generally, you have to register for it, get some sort of API key so that it knows who's accessing, and it adds you to like a whitelist underneath the hood. But cross-origin resource sharing comes up quite frequently when you're creating AJAX requests or when you're doing $HTTP. Because you're trying to make a request from like your localhost 3000, you're trying to ping like the OMDB database or Netflix or something. And occasionally Netflix won't is like, what is this localhost :3000? I don't like it, and I don't want that request to come into my API. Maybe you're trying to, spam them or send some like black hatty type stuff. So, but CORS is a pretty common issue. And sometimes it can be really frustrating to debug those things. But a service may be a good place to put some CORS logic if you need it, because you can share that service amongst all your other controllers, for example. And then finally, this is a really kind of funny one, but maybe you want to use a service with the function to inject, to replace every instance of the word JavaScript with a bagel in your app or something, because that would make a ton of sense. So the idea is that services is a great way to drive your code, and services are shareable. And it's very similar to the pattern we used in Unit 2, using module.exports, and then you could require that file in any other file that you wanted. So it's that same principle. Okay, so let's do some code pen, you guys. Any questions about what we've covered? I know some of that may have been a little bit wonky, and it is a little wonky, but we'll see an example, and maybe you guys will, some of the patterns will start to make sense to you. Any questions before we move forward? Okay, so what I want you guys to do is we're going to do this first part in CodePen just because it's the path of least resistance. So go ahead and open up a new CodePen.io. And then give me a thumbs up in Slack when you have a new one open and ready to go. And then I'll share my screen, and we're going to see an example of what a service looks like. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen, and we'll get to it. Make sure you guys can see this. We're not going to need our CSS section, just FYI. So if you want to minimize that, that'd be cool. And I don't have my really nice 4K screen with me, so I really don't have that much real estate, as much as I usually do, unfortunately. Not that that's any of you guys' concern. Okay. I know I can't manage. That's the thing. So I can't see everyone's face right now. That was kind of the point of that. All right. Okay, cool. So let's do this. The first thing we need to do, if we want to import, let me make this a little bigger, so I may change your screen there. So remember with CodePen, if we want to inject external JavaScript libraries or CSS libraries, CodePen makes that really user-friendly. So what we can do, the first thing we need to do is add Angular to this application. So go ahead and click on Settings, and then go over here to the JavaScript section. CodePen's the best. And then we can go down here to this Quick Add drop-down, and we're just going to click on Angular, and it'll add the CDN right here. And so we can't see that in the CodePen. It's just going on behind the scenes. But we definitely need to have Angular inserted into this pen for our stuff to work. So go ahead and make sure that you include Angular, and then you can save and close. And let me rename this week 10 Angular services. And I can Slack this out later for your reference. Cool. So we're just going to walk down the lesson, and we'll take a look at what a service looks like in the wild. All right, delivering a custom service. So let's create a custom service in CodePen for practice, and then we're actually going to do it in a full-scale application, the Jiffy app, once we get some practice with this. So make sure that you click on Settings, JavaScript to add Angular. We've already done that. Now let's instantiate a new service and a new controller. We're just going to keep this as minimal as possible. Now, when we play around with the Jiffy app later, we're going to want to put our service into a separate file. That's generally the way to go. But for this example, we're just going to put everything in this little JavaScript section of CodePen to keep it simple. And then I'm going to type this out longhand, and I would suggest you guys do the same instead of just copying and pasting, just to get some practice. So let's instantiate an Angular app with angular.module. We'll call this my app. And I need to add some square brackets to the lesson. So I'll do that. I will do that later. So it's a good practice, even if we aren't injecting anything initially. It's a good thing to have those square brackets there. Actually, maybe it works in CodePen without it, because this should work fine, but just to be consistent, I'll put the square brackets in there. And then let's create a basic controller. We're going to call this greeting controller, because we're going to do some hello worlding type of stuff, pretty basic. Let me know if you guys can't see this or if can't see enough of it or whatever. I'm trying to give you guys some room here. Yeah, then we'll declare a function called greeting controller. We'll do that down below. Let's go ahead and chain on the service. Let's instantiate a service, and we're going to chain it on to our main Angular app called my app, our main Angular module. Let's call this service greeter service. because why not? We could call it whatever we wanted to, though. Cool. Okay, great. So we have our module, we have a controller that we need to declare a function for, and also we have a service that we need to declare a function for. So let's do that down below. We'll just do the controller first. So let's do a greeting controller declaration. Oops, get rid of that P there. And then down below it, let's go ahead and instantiate our greeting service. We'll declare that function there too. Cool. Try to get a little bit more real estate here. All right. So let's get up to this point. Go ahead and give me a thumbs up in Slack when you get to this point, when you just get kind of the shell of everything built in CodePen. And again, I would just kind of point your attention when we're instantiating this dot service, when we're creating a new service, just take note that it's the same syntax as a controller. We're still calling it something, and then we're passing in the function that will be the meat of that service or controller. So pretty much the same pattern. Cool, got 6 thumbs ups. Let me know if you guys are having any issues, hiccups. Okay, 7 thumbs ups. Let's go to the next step. I'll go ahead and move forward. So the next thing we need to do is inject our greeter service into the main controller. In this case, it's called greeting controller. But just like $HTTP or any other service, we still need to inject this service into our controller. So up here, above the greeting controller, let's call that $inject on greeting controller. It's not quite as important in CodePen because we're not like pushing to production, but just to be consistent, because you guys will be pushing your app to production, just like to get into that practice. So we're going to inject the greeter service into greeting controller, like so. And then we also need to pass in greeting service as an argument, like that. And one thing to note, I think for the Jiffy, we'll probably do this, but just to point this out, I mentioned earlier that the convention with Angular services is to designate, put a $sign in front of the name, just to designate it as a service. You can do that if you wanted. We're going to do that in the next, when we refactor the Jiffy. But just to let you guys know, some folks like to do this. So they'd put a $sign since this is a service. It's totally up to you. It's just a preference. A lot of times I like to do that. It's kind of like in jQuery, putting a $sign before any jQuery variable that contains the jQuery object. So it's just, it's up to you if you want to do that. So go ahead and give me a thumb up. Did I misspell something? Oh, I did. My bad. Yeah, thanks for catching that. Yeah, this should be greeter. My bad. Greeter. Yeah, and I actually called it because we're going to create a greeting, this.greeting in a minute. So I've got it backwards. So go ahead and make sure that this is a greeter controller and greeter service. Thanks for catching that for me. Then it's going to bark, can't instantiate greeter service or greeter controller because it can't find it because I didn't name it that. So you guys have already seen a couple of those errors. Cool, greeter controller, greeter service. All right, looking good. All right. Do what, one more time?
Greeting controller on line 6.
Oh, thank you, yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, CodePen doesn't let you like do a Command D and select everything to update it. That's one of the downsides. But thanks for keeping me honest out there, you guys. The next thing we want to do, so this is pretty much it for like setting up and instantiating our controller and our service. Now let's just test it out. The first thing I'm going to do is, I like to do this. You guys probably get into this habit as well. I'm just going to console log just to make sure that this thing is actually loading. It's not so much important in CodePen because CodePen is kind of a self-contained environment. But you know, if we're working on an application like we are next, and we have several different files, several different script tags bringing those files in, we just want to make sure that the thing's wired up and turned on correctly. So sometimes I like to do a console log, something like greeter service is alive, just something like that. And then in CodePen, we can click on this little console selection here, and that's like the little CodePenny console section. Oops, meant to clear it. Yeah, so this is kind of the CodePen version of a console. It's not quite as full featured as your Chrome DevTools, but that is the CodePen version. So let me refresh it. Let's see if we get that console log there. Why didn't you console log for me? I think because we need to actually add it in our HTML. So we haven't done that part yet. We'll get to that right next. We actually need to put some HTML and declare the ng app directive, in order for it to be loaded correctly. But before we put the HTML in, let's just go ahead and put some properties down here. Again, we're just going to test it out. So if you look there in that screenshot, let's do a var self equals this. And let's just do a self.greeting. And we'll make this say the greeter service says hi. Cool. So just a very basic greeting, and then we'll bind that to the HTML to our view just to make sure it's working. And I put one more step in here. I was just trying to make this as obvious as possible. So we can go ahead and do this last little step. This may be a little overkill, but later in the lesson, we create another factory object. So as you saw from that Todd Moto article, two really popular ways to drive your code are using Angular services and or Angular factories. For our purposes, they kind of do the same thing, but I'm going to leave you with an example of what a factory looks like, because it's really developer preference, which one, the pattern's a little different, and it's really whichever one you're most comfortable with. But I was going to leave you some code. We won't walk through it necessarily, but I'll leave you some code if you want to check out what an Angular factory looks like. And so that's why I wanted to be a little bit more semantic and specific here. So let's just do a self.greeting from service. This is a little unnecessary, but just to be a little bit more clear later on. So remember that we talked about this last week about declaring, we can declare a function, and then we want to actually attach it to a self.variable of some sort, self.property, self.variable. So let's just do a self.greeting from service, because later we'll do a greeting from a factory. And we'll make this equal service.greeting. Oh, I'm sorry. Hold on one sec. Such a dum-dum. Okay, this is actually going into the controller because that's what we're feeding in from the service. Sorry, my friends. Now it's coming back to me. So what we're doing is we're injecting the greeter service. So our greeting that we're going to serve to our view is actually going to be the greeting from our service. So we inject the greeter service into our greeter controller, and then you can think of greeter service as just a big object, right, with keys and values. So we can call greeter service.greeting, and it's going to hit this greeting down here in our service. And so just to demonstrate how we can pass information back and forth and then put it into the view, let's create a self.greeting from service, and that's going to equal the greeting property from the greeter service. And so later on, for example, when we move all that $HTTP code out of our Giphy controller into a Giphy service, this is the same pattern. So we'll put all of those API calls into a separate service. We'll inject the service into the controller, and then we can, it's just like an object. We can use dot notation to grab the properties and methods that we need. So that's it for the controller and the service. Let's just dump some HTML in here and see this janky thing render. And for this one, if you guys just want to copy this, because we're lazy. So go ahead and grab that code, and you can put it into the HTML. It's pretty simple. So with CodePen, remember that CodePen assumes that anything in that HTML window is your body section. So we don't really have to put these body tags, but if we did want to use, Angular and use an ng-app directive, then we can put those tags in there. So that's what we're doing here. We'll just create a body tag with ng-app, and then a basic section tag with controller. And then let's see this controller.greeting from service. Let's see that render. So let me save that. So our console log is working, so that's good. So we're getting the greeter services alive. So Kieran, you're getting some errors all over in the console. Okay, so we can take a look at that in a sec. So I have the ng controller directive, greeter controller as controller. And then here I'm binding controller or CTRL.greeting from service. And so we should see that greeting right there. So let me make sure that I didn't misspell something down here. Greeting from service, greeting from service, greeter service greeting, self.greeting, greeter service says hi, where self equals this. Let's see, I don't see anything misspelled. Let me try this. So let me put a, oh, you guys, I'm such a silly goose. I didn't do a var self equals this in our controller, which is fine. We're not really going to add much more to this controller. So didn't really have to do that var self equals this because this is pretty simple code, but just to get into that habit, because generally that's what you'll want to do in like a full stack application. But yeah, so if you put that var self equals this, and then we called self right there. And then you should see this lovely, the greeter service says hi. So that's where we are. So let's pause right there and give me a thumbs up in Slack. We'll make sure that all of you guys are up to speed here. Let me take a screenshot of this, and you guys can give me a thumbs up. As soon as it reloads here. So I will admit that this is not the most sophisticated example, but I just want to show you guys a very simple example of the pattern, and then we're going to refactor the Giphy app, and that's going to be much more substantial. But I just wanted you guys to see an example of the pattern. So give me a thumbs up in Slack if you are seeing that rendered in CodePen. So the greeter service says hi. So if you have that, then it's not a lot of code, but at least we did create an Angular service, a custom service. We're injecting that into a controller. And then to dry up our code, we can put stuff into the service instead of muddying up our controller. Because as our code base gets larger, if we dump everything in the controller, that's just going to be like, looking for needles and haystacks, which we don't want. But if anyone's having any issues come on mic and we can take a look at your code and get you up to speed. And also, let me paste in my JavaScript code if you just want to dump it in there. So this is my JavaScript stuff right there. All right, let's see what Kieran's working with here. $ injector, okay. Service provider, greeter controller, greeter service, okay. Let's see what your code looks like here. Controller, service, greeter service. Greeter controller, .inject, greeter service. Okay, so Kieran, you put it on line 6, you put $ greeter service, which is fine. We just need to be consistent. So if you want to use the $, that's cool. But what you want to do on line 4 is make sure that when you instantiate your .service, make sure that you put $ greeter service, because that's the name. That's how Angular is going to look to register that service constructor function. So if you want to do the $, that's totally cool. Just put a $ on line 4 on the quoted, on the greeter service, in the string greeter service. And then on line 8, the argument that you pass into the controller, you want to be $ greeter service as well. So the name of the declared function, you could put a $ on that or not. I mean, that's not a big deal. But if you want to use that $, the string is what gets passed around the Angular world, right? That declared function is only going to, remain here in this file. But if you want to access the greeter service from other files, that's what that string, whatever you call it, whatever string that you name the service, that's how other controllers, how other modules in Angular will be able to access that code. So yeah. And so Kieran, let me know if that gets you cleaned up there.
So I have your code. It says the greeter service says hi. The console log still has all that red stuff. I don't know if it's
try doing a maybe it just isn't cleared out. You can do a Command K and that'll clear out the console. Maybe it's just staying in there from the previous, because sometimes I think CodePen will save the code, but when it detects a change, it'll save it, but that's not the same as refreshing the page, I believe. So maybe if you refresh, maybe it'll clear out the console, or just do a Control K. As long as you see the greeter service says hi, that's fine for right now. We're going to move forward to something more substantial. Yeah, so Kieran, if you don't mind giving me a thumbs up, I see 6 thumbs ups on that AngularJS services. Cool, 8 thumbs ups. Okay, great. Well, thank you for that. Let me show you one more thing. So that was an example of using a property called .greeting. Let's take a quick peek, just as an example, just so you see what it looks like. Let's add a method to that service called sayHello, and then we can pass in as an argument the name that we want to say hello to. So just one more quick example of a method in a service, and then we'll move forward to refactoring our Jiffy app. So one more example of a service, just so you have some sample code. Let's add a method to our greeter service. So we already have self.greeting down here. Let me make this a little bit more room here. Cool. So in our greeter service, we have self.greeting. And down below it, just for grins, let's add a self.sayHello method. And this is going to be a function that takes a name as an argument, whatever name we want to pass in. And then when we call this method, we're going to return. Does anyone remember what these backticks and the $ stuff means? What do we call that? It's an ES6 convention.
String literal.
Yeah, template string literal. Yeah. Cool. So we're just going to return self.greeting. space, and then the name that we pass in. Put a semicolon there. Cool. And so go ahead and in your greeter controller, go ahead and attach that method to a method that's called self.sayHelloFromService. And I'll put that into Slack. Assign that method to a controller method. Yeah, so assign that sayHello method to a controller method named self.sayHelloFromService. So what would that look like? And I'll go ahead and walk through it. And it's also in the README there. So for this one, it's the same thing as the greeting. If we want to do a say hello from service. And again, we're just gonna, it's just like a big crazy object. I mean, it is an object. So we'll do greeter service dot say hello. And then just to test it out, go ahead and pass in your name if you want, or you can use my name, either way. It's all good, no worries. So now we have self.sayHelloFromService in our controller. And then the last piece is we want to bind that in our view. And so I'll open up my little HTML area here. And I'm just going to copy line 4. And then down here below it, we can bind say hello from service. And let me capitalize my hello. Like so. And there we go. So we're grabbing the greeting and we're grabbing the say hello method from our service. So again, it's kind of a contrived example, but at least we can get an idea of the pattern. So we would create a service calling .service, very similar to creating a controller. And all we need to do is inject that service into our controller or whatever module we want to use. Same way as we would any other service, like $HTTP or $state, $state params, which we used, any of those. And then we'll have access to all the properties and methods of greeter service inside our controller. And remember, if we had multiple controllers, and if we wanted all 5 of our controllers to have access to a say hello method, all we need to do is write that code one time in a service, and then we can inject that service into as many controllers as we want, and then we'd have access to it. So it's a really, really nice way to drive your code. Cool. So let me Slack out this final. Actually, I'll just send you the CodePen link. I think that'd be a little bit more efficient. So let me Slack this out. I'm going to stop my screen share for the moment. And then in the time we have remaining up to lab, I want to talk about refactoring our Jiffy app from Friday, because I think that's when you'll really be able to see the benefit of using services. So let me Slack out my awesome CodePen. So there's my finished code. And if you're following along in the README, I should have just moved this to the bottom. But like I said, if you read that Todd Moto article at the top of the lesson, the 2 really popular frequent ways to drive your code in Angular is either using a service or a factory. Now, it's at the end of the day, it's pretty much a developer preference. For our purposes, there really isn't that much of a difference performance-wise. However, factories do look different from services, the way that we code them. So what I did is I put a little bit of a section in the README for factories. And I'm not going to walk through it now in the interest of time, but if you are interested, I put all of the service code in the context of what it would look like as an Angular factory, using a greeter factory with a greeter controller. So if you want to, feel free to check out that README later on, if this is something that's of interest, and if you want to see kind of visually the difference between structuring a service pattern versus a factory pattern. So I'll leave that for you guys there. And I also have a link to a finished code pin with the factory built out as well. And that's in the README too. So if you want to geek out later, I'll left that for you guys. So let's take a 5-minute break. Let me get set up for our refactor. But any questions about services before we move forward? Okay, cool. So take a 5-minute break. While you're on break, if you want, I'm going to use, Colin pushed up the Jiffy solution on Friday. I'm going to use that version to build on, to refactor. So if you want to grab a copy of that to play with, or if you have your own version from Friday, feel free to use that as well. But we just want a version of that Jiffy app to have something to refactor. And I will Slack out the link in case you missed it. But either way, if you want to work on your version or Colin's version, we just want something to play around with. So go ahead and do that on your break. Let's meet back at 3:40 p.m. Eastern time, and we'll move forward. Do this. Let's do some Angular services. So we saw a very contrived example of what the service pattern looks like. Now we're going to kick it up a notch, and let's see kind of why we would want to do this in a real world application. And we're going to use the Jiffy app from Friday to play around with Angular services. So who has a working copy of the Jiffy app? Either your version or maybe Colin's solution from Friday. Either one is fine. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen. Let me show you kind of the setup and make sure that we're all good to go before we move forward. So here's the Jiffy app. Like I said, I'm going to use Colin's solution that he pushed over the weekend just to refactor. And so the point of this exercise, we're not going to get any different behavior. So the behavior is going to be the same, and that's how we'll know that this is successful. The idea is to get practice if we wanted to dry up our controller code, because as we look at this code right now in the app.js file, so if you go into public, scripts, app.js, there's a lot going on in here. And this is only like, 5 different, well, get, I guess, create, read, update, delete. We don't have a new, we don't have an edit, I don't think. In any event, the point of the story is that our app.js controller file can get really unruly quite quickly. So one way to dry this up would be using a service. So we're going to use this app to do so. So what I want you guys to do is go ahead and make sure that you have your app open in Atom and that you have it running on Nodemon so we can move forward. So I want to make sure that we're all ready to go. So give me a thumbs up when you have your Jiffy app running on localhost.
Mark, you're in party time.
Oh my God. Thank you, sir.
As well he should be.
That's right. Why wouldn't I be in party time, you guys? I've been looking for y'all this whole time. No one was in there. I tell you, I come to Alabama. It's an hour behind. Throws off my entire schedule. It's just, it's crazy. So yeah, go ahead and give me a thumbs up. So I want to make sure that we have everything ready to go before we start refactoring, butchering this thing, if you will. And I'm gonna push up. I'll push up the solution that what I'm gonna do is we're gonna refactor one of these together, and then for lab time, I'm gonna have you go ahead and refactor, delete, update, show, whatever the 4 or 5 other ones we have. And that's gonna be your lab time. But we're gonna do the first one together. So I wanna make sure we're all working before we start refactoring. I really like, I don't know, I was thinking about it this weekend. I really like refactoring stuff. I don't know why. I'm just opening up to you guys. I just really enjoy it. I think there's some satisfaction about like going back to an earlier piece of code, maybe something that you wrote, 3 months ago, or something that you wrote, beginning of December when you started the course. There's something pretty satisfying about going back and being able to read some code and be like, yeah, I would have done this totally different, or I could refactor this, into 1 line versus 3. I really enjoy doing that, trying to make your code as concise and readable as possible. Nerd alert. So just sharing. Okay, so I see 7 thumbs ups. Let us move forward to refactor our Jiffy application. Okay, so let's see how services can be super useful outside of CodePen. So what we're going to do is refactor the $HTTP API calls into a service. Now, $HTTP is in of itself a service. It's a built-in Angular service, but remember that we can create our own. And frequently, one of the most common use cases for a service is to refactor any kind of like external third-party API calls into a service, just in case you want to use those calls in some other part of your application. But a lot of the time, API calls, because generally your controllers, you would have like the basic RESTful routes, the 7 or so routes. Anything outside of that, it's kind of a developer preference, but generally you'd want to put that extra logic into a service or some other module. Again, you'll come up with your own, like the way that you like to structure things, which is cool, but that would be one reason to use a service. So the first thing we need to do is create a Jiffy service file. So we want to put this in a separate file. And let me open up a new terminal tab. Let me make this a little larger for you guys. And you can see the file path there in the screenshot. We're going to put this in our scripts folder. So we can touch public JavaScript, and then we'll create a file called jiffyservice.js. Am I in the right one? Public.js. Did I misspell something there? Let me see. Yeah, I called it scripts. So in this version, I just copied a brand new version from Colin's Friday coverage. So if you guys worked on it privately, maybe you called it JS or JavaScript instead of scripts or something, that's fine. Just know that we need to go wherever you put your JavaScript files in the public folder. Just make sure that you put it in there. So in my previous, when I was working on this, I had called it JS, but Colin's pushed up version, he used scripts. So that's cool. So I'll change this to scripts. Why don't you like that either? Oh, because I'm in my public. Let me get back out. There we go. And so we just want to create a separate service. That's kind of the best practice, a separate file for our service rather. So we should have an empty jiffyservice.js file. And then you can see the code in the screenshot. This is very similar to what we did in CodePen. So the name of this module or this app is Jiffy Angular app. That's what Colin called it. So if we want to add other stuff to that, we just need to declare it here at the top. So Jiffy Angular app, and then let's create a service for this. And remember earlier that I said sometimes the convention is totally a developer preference, but some developers like to put that $sign in front of the name of their service just to let the application or other devs know that this is a service module. So just so you know, for this exercise, I went with $sign Jiffy service just to be difficult, just for funsies. So we're going to name this $sign Jiffy service. The actual name of the function doesn't really matter because that's still going to be local in this file. But this name, the string we pass in, that's going to be what we're able to see in all the other modules and all the other modules in this Angular environment. So that needs to be very specific. And let's go ahead and do a Jiffy service inject, because since we're moving out, we're ripping out all the $sign HTTP information from our controller to put it into a service. We now need to inject that $sign HTTP into our service. So that's why we're going to do that here. So let's do Jiffy service, and we'll use $sign inject, and we'll pass in our $sign HTTP here. So services are just, they're objects, they're modules, just like any other module in Angular. So we can do dependency injection with these as well. And then let's go ahead and declare our Jiffy service function. And we need to pass in that $sign HTTP into our Jiffy service. And then, like I said, just like to put a little message here to let me know that it's wired up before I start writing code in there. So I'm going to put Jiffy service ready for action. And that should be a good little start for our Jiffy service, at least enough for us to test out to make sure that we've required dependency injected things correctly. So that's kind of our step one. So what do we need to do Sorry, go ahead and give me a thumbs up in Slack once you finish that first step. And it's really easy to overlook step 2. But once we create a new controller or a new service or any new file in our Angular environment, what's the first thing that we need to do after we create that file? How do we let Angular know about it? How do we make sure that that file is loaded? What do we do?
Require statements.
Okay, yeah, so in Unit 2, we use require. The Angular syntax, the Angular library, we don't use require necessarily. It's a little bit more, Angular has its own rhyme and reason for why we don't need require exclusively. But kind of in that same vein, how do we just let our app know? How do we let our Nodemon server know about this file after we've created it? How do we make sure that it loads the file?
Module exports.
We added to as a script.
Yeah, so we need to add the link of the file in our index.html. And then to Mike's point, yeah, so module.exports and require, the require pattern, that's what we use for Unit 2. And that's essentially what we're doing here, but we're just doing it in a little bit more of a sophisticated way. The way that Angular wants us to do it is still the same principle, but we don't have to write require, we don't have to write module.exports, because Angular, the good people of Angular have set all that stuff up under the hood and wired it up for us. So all we need to do is dependency injection, for example. That would be our requiring an external file. But to Alejandra's point, before we even get that far, we definitely need to go into our index.html, and we need to let our app know to load this file when the browser loads. And remember that the order of this really matters. So let me put a screenshot into Slack. So go ahead and add a script tag and give me a thumbs up when you're finished with this. And just let our index.html know about this file. And if you take a look at the order of those files, this is going to be really important. So we need to add this Jiffy service file. We need to put it at the bottom. So clean this up just a little bit. Inside here, we'll do scripts and then our Jiffy service. And that's not only for services. Remember, anytime we create a new controller, any new file, new router file, anything at all, since Angular is managing our front end stuff, we need to make sure that we include the link in the head. Need to make sure that we link that up. So let me refresh that. And again, we haven't really put any code in here yet, but if we go to the console, we're still not seeing our Jiffy service is ready for action. Why aren't we seeing that yet? What's the last thing that we need to do? So we created the new service file. We put a link to it in our index.html, which is good. But the service hasn't been instantiated yet. What's the last thing we need to do to make sure that this service is actually loaded or instantiated, rather?
Do you need to call it somewhere?
Yeah, we need to use dependency injection and actually inject it into our controller. So our controller will actually like start that chain of events. Yeah. So let's go into app.js right here. And up at the top, so remember that we just created a custom service. We can treat it just like any of our other services, like $scope, $HTTP. And what we can do, let me stretch this out just a little bit so you guys can see. So right here, we just need to pass in that Jiffy service, like so. And I notice that we don't have the inject information here. And that's fine. We'll just move past that for now. When we're running this locally, the $inject is not as crucial. When we push this to production, you would definitely want to use that $inject. But just so you know, if we had $inject here, we would also pass in the Jiffy service into that inject method. But as long as we inject it in the controller, we'll be fine for this example. So now if I refresh, you should see this Jiffy service ready for action. Let me make that a little larger. So if you see that, you are in good shape. And so we'll wait to make sure everyone gets caught up. So give me a thumbs up if you see that in your console. And while you're doing that, just let me break my app real quick. So what would happen if I put this Jiffy service in the wrong order? Let me move it up. So I'm loading the router, whatever. I have Angular up here. I'm loading the router, but I'm injecting the service into my controller, which is in app.js. So now I'm loading the service before I even load up the controller. So let's see what happens when I refresh this time. It still works. Dang it. Okay, let me move it up even. I'll move it up to the top of the stack here. Let's see if that breaks it. There we go, thank you. So the point being, this is a pretty common error. I think we saw these last week. So usually this is like 80–90% of the time, it's either a misspelling or maybe you don't have the script tags in the proper load order. So we can see here, uncaught error, module Jiffy Angular app is not available, either misspelled it or forgot to load it, etc. If registering the module, ensure that you specify the dependencies, blah, blah, blah. Then down here, unknown provider, Jiffy service provider. So for the second one, it's trying to load the controller file, Jiffy service. It's the point being, we don't have to go down the rabbit hole. The point being the order matters, right? So if we get these out of order, something's going to try to load and instantiate something else before it actually has the code or vice versa. So the order is super important here. Let me change that back. Need router at the top. There we go. So this isn't that big a deal. We have like 3 JavaScript files, but consider with larger, fuller stack applications, you may have several JavaScript files, and so they can really get out of whack. If you recall last week, sure. Yep.
Can I see your code again? I can't.
Yeah. Which one? The index or the service?
The service.
Okay. Yeah. Let me move it up here. Yes, there's the service. And then in app.js, make sure that you inject this $, Jiffy service into the controller.
Okay, I see where my error is. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, anyway, what I was saying is that as your apps grow more complex, you may have tons of dependencies and tons of different files. And I mentioned a dependency, a package manager for the front end last week. We're not going to go over it in class, but it's a pretty common, pretty popular one, and you're probably going to use that when you get to your future gigs. Does anyone remember what the front end version of NPM is? So Node Package Managers for the back end. You guys remember the package manager that manages front end dependencies? Bower. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so Bower's a really popular one. If you want to check out their documentation. For the apps that we're creating, we like to do it, really roll up our sleeves and do it by hand. And the apps we're creating don't have that many front-end dependencies, but Bower would be the front-end version of NPM, and that's a really big industry standard. So you're probably going to run into that very soon. Yeah, thanks for that, Cody. That is a pretty little bird. Cool. How many thumbs ups do we have? So we should be good and configured now. We tested out our console, so we know that the Jiffy service is loaded. We know that the files, we're doing the dependency injection correctly with the injecting the service. The file is loaded correctly. We aren't getting any errors. So now we're on a good slate to start hacking up this code and refactoring it. So let me check out how many thumbs ups we have. All right, 7 thumbs ups. Works for me. Let's move forward. And the first thing I want to do is let's refactor that get GIF function, the one that gets all, the one that makes the API calls to grab, you know, the random GIF. Let's work on that one first. So to start, we're going to rip out the $sign. It sounds so rude. Anywho, whatever. To start, we're going to rip out the $HTTP API call from our controller's get GIF function. One other thing I should mention, just remind me of this, we'll go back. But after we refactor all of this stuff, we should be able, it's not a big deal, but we should be able to remove the $HTTP from our Jiffy controller. Because after we finish this process, we won't have any use for $HTTP in our controller. All of that code will be in our service. So we have to inject it in the service, but you know, we could, you know, just delete this at the end of the day, like so. But we can only remove that after we've, you know, refactored everything. So our first, the get GIF function. So the first thing we want to do is, so right here, should be around like line 25 or so. Make this a little larger here. So the first thing we want to do is go ahead and rip out the .get. So you can go ahead and just cut that out. Doesn't that feel good? And I'm just going to paste it into my service for a minute. We're going to clean that up a little bit here shortly. But kind of the key is we're going to want to rip out all of the API calls, all of the $HTTP, and we're going to put them into the service. So we can go ahead and rip that out. And we're going to add some new code here. So we'll come back to that. But I'm going to do a little placeholder just to remind me. Cool. So now let's play around with our service. And this is what our service function, our service method is going to look like. So since we're moving this to the service, let's create, we'll call this get GIF. So we're going to make this .get GIF. And we'll assign an anonymous function to this. Again, this is going to be the pattern for pretty much all of our refactoring today. And let me move this up into that get GIF. And the first thing I'm going to do, since all this is happening asynchronously, is I'm going to put a return statement inside this function. So we created this .get GIF, and that equals an anonymous function. And we're going to return that $HTTP.get. The return is really important. If we don't do the return, we won't get an error message, but we are going to get some undefined messages in our controller down the road. That's really the key to this stuff, particularly with $HTTP. Since it's asynchronous, make sure that you return things. Use the return statements quite liberally, because not only is it asynchronous, but since we're also dealing with some .then, some promises, remember that promises, we need to be very explicit with what we want returned, what we want passed into the next promise in the chain. So this is the first step. We need to make sure that we return .get. So once we do that .get to the Jiffy API, we're going to chain a return on a .then onto it, a promise. So let's do a .then, and then you remember that pattern. .then takes a callback function, and if you look at the screenshot, this is technically the response from the http.get. You could call this response. You could call this whatever you wanted. I'm going to call this the Jiffy response, just to be consistent with the lesson. And then we're going to put some code in here. So I'll put a pin in it just for a second, let you guys get caught up. But let me ask you guys, given what you know about promises, given what you know about this code, so here's our controller, and here's our service. So does someone want to take a stab? I mean, just kind of spitballing here. What do you think we'd want to put inside here? Or here for that matter, but let's finish up this. So consider that we're ripping this code out of our controller and we're outsourcing it to a service. But we still want that same data. We still want the same response. So does anyone want to take a stab at what this code should look like? What do we want to do with the response object from this $HTTP get? Any thoughts? Let's see what Audrey says. Audrey says self.gif URL equals gif response .data.data.image URL. Yeah, so Audrey, where would you put that? Would that go into the service or the controller?
That would be coming from the controller to the service, because isn't that what we're doing? We're removing it and putting it somewhere else?
Yeah, so we're putting that API call into the service. So it'd actually be the opposite. So the service is what's going out to get the GIF information. It's getting the response, and then the service is going to stick that into the controller. So it's the right idea, but it's just the opposite. But you're on the right track. So we'll go with what Audrey put here into Slack. Yeah, and that's super close. We're essentially, if you look in the controller, the code we had, when we get the response from our API, this is really what we're interested in, is Jiffy response.data.data.image URL. So Colin walked us through that crazy response object. Remember, it's like data, then there's another data property inside that. Like, it can get really nested. But all we want is we're just outsourcing that up here to our service. So let's return that. So we're going to return the .get, and then specifically in this promise, we're going to return the parsed JSON. So we're going to go ahead and be friendly and go ahead and dig down and grab that image URL, and that's what we're going to return. So when we call this .getGIF, we're going to get the URL that we need back, and that's kind of the idea. Cool. So we really didn't do that much here. We just moved this line of code, and we kind of just repurposed this line of code and wrapped it in a promise. When in doubt, just throw return statements on everything. That's my motto. But just to be clear, before we get too ahead of ourselves, and I put this in the screenshot, I like to console log things. So one thing that we tried to preach is, one step at a time and such. So I'm going to throw a console log in there just so we can see that data, just in case there's any errors. So that looks good for our service. So we're going to let the service do all the work to tidy up our controller. So now let's come back into our controller and finish up, clean up that code. So let me put the screenshot into Slack for you guys. Okay. So if we go back to our Jiffy controller, inside the getGIF method, Now we're going to call $Jiffy service dot get GIF. So it's kind of like the greeter service that we created in CodePen. So what we want to do inside this function is we're going to call, not greeter service, geez, Jiffy. Make sure it's capitalized just because that's how we instantiated it. Jiffy service dot get GIF. So we're essentially just going to call this method. And remember that in our controller, we injected our Jiffy service here. So we have access to any properties and methods that that service / object has for us. So we can call Jiffy service dot get GIF. And we need to actually invoke that function. That's really important. So make sure you put the parentheses there. Clean that up a touch. And so we call that, it's going to go and hit our Jiffy service. So it's going to hit this. It's going to go do $HTTP to our API. The response that it gets back is going to return that response. But instead of the full response, we're just going to go ahead and in our service, we're going to let our service go ahead and trim up to grab the specific data that we want, that image URL. So this right here is going to return that URL. And when it does, since it's asynchronous, we're going to pass it into a promise. So we'll do this dot then. So now, instead of self.gifurl equals Jiffy response, blah, 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 what is self.gifurl going to equal now? What do we want it to equal? How could we refactor this right here?
Jiffy response?
Yeah. Yeah, the only thing we did is tomato, tomato, but we're just going to go ahead and parse that stuff out in our service. Kind of the point of the service is to like dump as much logic and code as possible. We're going to outsource it, right? So just so we can keep our controller nice and tidy. So yeah, so now we're already parsing it in the service. So now this is going to return the Jiffy response directly. And just to confirm that, again, to be nice and proper, I'm going to put a console log here just so we can see it in action. And so once we get that Jiffy response, then we'll do the $state.go to go to the GIF state. So we don't need to touch any of that stuff. The only thing the only thing that we really did is just grab that $HTTP get and dump all of that code into a separate service. And some of the benefits of that, it cleans up our controller. So this controller was already getting pretty dense. So it cleans it up a little bit. And if we wanted to, maybe we wanted to refactor that API call, maybe instead of the Jiffy API, maybe we want to hit the Netflix API to get a poster, or the OMDB API. Maybe we could modularize this code in here. And so maybe we just pass in like the Netflix URL or the Jiffy URL or the weather API URL. And we're going to do that HTTP get on whatever API we want to hit. So maybe, maybe there's a way to refactor that, but maybe we create a service that is just for hitting third-party APIs. So that may be one reason. And then we can inject that service into whatever controller that we wanted. But let's make sure this thing actually works. So I'm going to save our code and let's refresh. Give it a second to refresh. And so remember, kind of the idea is that no news is good news. We're not trying to change the behavior. We're only trying to refactor and clean up our code. So the behavior should be the same. So as long as this works, so if I go to get GIF, cool. It looks like it's still working the same. So that's awesome. So the end user probably isn't really going to appreciate that, but we as developers will appreciate having a little bit more concise code. So once I know that that is working, oh boy, that's not safe for work there. Testing, and we save that. And there we go. So everything's working just fine. And so now that I know that's working, if I wanted to clean this up, let me get rid of those console logs, just in the spirit of keeping this a little more concise. And so there we go. So I think the controller is a little bit cleaner now. It's a little bit nicer. And then we have all of that other stuff in our service. So let's put a pin in it right there. And I want to, if anyone's getting any errors, I want to help you guys out. So give me a thumbs up if your service is working correctly. Cool, 3 thumbs ups. Let's see. Cool, 6 thumbs up, 7 thumbs ups, awesome. So what do you guys think about this pattern, this idea of services? I see a thumbs down. I only see like from the neck down. Let me stop my screen share, by the way. What do you guys think? Could you see how this may be useful at some point as your application scales up? Is this just like, why are you killing my Monday? So again, I just want to, again, just like to refresh, this is not something that's like required in your project, but this is just a really common, important concept in Angular, and it's something that I can pretty much assure you that will come up in some form in a technical interview, particularly as it pertains to Angular. So just so you're familiar with what a service is, what a custom service is, and what it does. And if you want to take a little bit of a deeper dive, just read up on services versus factories. Pretty much if you read that Todd Moto article again and just, have a little bit of that stick in here before an interview, I think you'll be in good shape. But as your app's growing complexity on the Angular side, services are super, super handy. And like Mike said, you can think of services, custom services, as the module.exports and the require that we used in Unit 2. So it is pretty much the same principle. Angular is much more powerful, obviously. We're just kind of scratching the surface, but that would be a good use case for it. Any questions about what we covered this afternoon with services? Okay. So what I thought we'd do for lab time is I'm going to put you guys into your breakouts, and I want you guys to finish up the Jiffy app, finish up refactoring. So this will be good practice just with $HTTP in addition to using a custom service. But I want you guys to finish up refactoring the save GIF, the update GIF, the get saved GIFs, and then the delete GIF. GIF. Do you guys call it GIF or GIF? I never say it successfully, consistently. Sorry, depends on the day. I spell it with a J. I don't know. I'm just all out of sorts. But I'll put you guys in the breakouts. I want you guys to refactor those 4 into your service that we created, and that'll be our lab time. So let me put together these breakouts and put you guys in the breakouts. And so remember that the idea, we're not getting any different behavior. We're just refactoring the app. So as long as your app works the same, you're in excellent shape. Yeah, we're kicking off our project in one more day. It's gonna be awesome. Okay, so open up the rooms and we'll see you guys around 5:30. Just ping me if you need anything.
Still recording.
Oh, thanks.